Hey guys, a very welcome to my YouTube channel. So today I'm going to explain you about a topic from the subject oral and maxillofacial surgery. So the topic for today is mandibular fracture. So let's get started. Okay, so what is fracture? So any breach in the continuity of the normal anatomic configuration of bone is termed as fracture. That means if for example, if I draw a bone here. So this is the normal anatomic configuration of the bone which I am drawing. Now if there is any breach, that means there is any discontinuity in this anatomic configuration like this discontinuity, that means that is fracture. Okay, so this is the easiest definition. Now coming on to the classifications of the mandibular fracture. So there are various classification of the mandibular fracture which are given. So one by one I'll be explaining about them. So, number one is Dinmann's and Natwigs's classification of mandibular fracture. So, in order to understand this, I had drawn a figure of a mandibular bone here. So, this classification was given by Dinmann and Natwigs. So, this is known as Dinmann and Natwigs classification. So, this classification is based on the anatomic configuration or basically anatomic origin. Okay, this is based on anatomic origin. That means एनाटॉमिकली जिस एरिया में फ्रैक्चर होगा उसके अकॉर्डिंगली हम इस क्लासिफिकेशन में फ्रैक्चर के नाम देंगे. ठीक है. सो द वेरी फर्स्ट फ्रैक्चर that is under the Dinmann's and Natwigs classification is your symphyseal fracture or the midline fracture. So as you can see in this figure, this is the central incisor and this is the central incisor of the opposite side. So between these two central incisor, if the fracture occurs, then that fracture comes under the first category, that is your symphyseal fracture or the midline fracture. Okay, so this fracture kind of occurs only 16%. So let me write down here what is the symphyseal fracture. It is the fracture occurring between two central incisors. Okay. Coming on to the second category, that is your parasymphyseal fracture. Okay, so now moving ahead, this particular thing that you are saying is called as mental foramen. It is kind of situated between canine and the first premolar. So the parasymphyseal fracture are the fracture that are seen at the canine region or basically ahead of the mental foramen. कैनाइन रीजन पे जो भी फ्रैक्चर दिखेगा या फिर मेंटल फोरामेन से आगे, दैट मीन्स दिस पर्टिकुलर एरिया ऑफ द फ्रैक्चर comes under the parasymphyseal fracture. Okay, so let me write down here what is parasymphyseal fracture. These are the fracture at canine region or ahead of mental foramen. यानी कि या तो कैनाइन रीजन या मेंटल फोरामेन के जो आगे वाला रीजन है सिम्फाइसिस के जस्ट बाद में, दैट रीजन में जो भी क्लास फ्रैक्चर होगा दैट कम्स अंडर पैरासिम्फाइसियल फ्रैक्चर. ओके, नाउ कम्स द थर्ड कैटेगरी, दैट इज योर बॉडी फ्रैक्चर. सो व्हाट इज बॉडी फ्रैक्चर? सो द एरिया आफ्टर द मेंटल फोरामेन or basically we can say the area between the canine or the angle of the mandible is known as body region. This is the canine and this is the angle. As you can see, I have labeled it here. This particular region is the angle of the mandible. So from this area to this area, this particular area is known as body of the mandible. So any fracture occurring in this particular area is known as body fracture. Okay, and the body fracture kind of comprises around 22% of the whole. Okay, so what is body fracture? Body fracture is a fracture between canine and the angular mandible. Or we can say behind mental foramen. As we have seen that ahead of the mental foramen was the parasymphyseal fracture, and behind the mental foramen is your body fracture. Now coming up with the fourth category, that is your angle fracture. Okay, so basically as the name suggests, the angle fracture is the fracture that occurs in the angle area of the mandible, and this kind of comprises around 25%. Okay, so I'm not writing it. Now coming on to the fifth category, that is your ramus fracture. So ramus fracture is also known as the area. Let me show you here. So for the ramus fracture, you must need to know about this particular U-shaped area, which is known as sigmoid notch. Okay, so starting from the sigmoid notch, if we draw a triangle, one side ending on the anterior border of the ramus and the another dotted side of the triangle ending on the posterior border of the ramus, and this particular part of the angle. So this area all comprises ramus region. Okay, so any fracture occurring in between these two triangular uh, lines that are drawn, forming an apex at the sigmoid notch and a line which I had drawn at the angle, any fracture occurring in this area comprises of ramus fracture, which occurs around 4%. Okay, so now moving on ahead with the sixth category, that is your condylar fracture. So similarly, as the name suggests, condylar fracture are the fracture which comprises of the condyle of the mandible, as you can say this area. So condyle fracture kind of comprises around 29%. So this is a maximum area where the fracture occurs, like this. Okay, so this is the condyle. Now the seventh category is your coronoid fracture, which comprises only 1%. So this is the coronoid of the mandible. You can see I have labeled it. Okay. Now the last category under Denman's and Natwigs's classification is your dento-alveolar fracture. So what is dento-alveolar fracture? As you can see, dento-alveolar. If we break down this term, there is dento means teeth and alveolar means alveolus. So this is the alveolus and these are the teeth. So any fracture occurring in this particular area comprises of dento-alveolar fracture, and this, if I tell you in percentage, then this will be around 3%. Okay, so the maximum fracture that occurs on the condylar area, and then on the angle fracture, then body fracture, then the symphyseal fracture, then the ramus fracture, then the dento-alveolar fracture, and the rest comprises around parasymphyseal or the coronoid fracture. So this was all about the first classification of the mandibular fracture, which I had told you, that is Denman's and Natwigs's classification. So I hope it is clear. In my later video, I'll be continuing with other classifications of the mandibular fracture.